Alright, we're going to talk a little bit about spatialization. Now, when we're talking about acoustics and we're talking about spatialization and acoustics, in that context to where we're talking about acoustics in the context of what sounds, what is happening to sound in a room or in some type of environment. And when you're looking at that, we're going to talk a little bit about that and not get too deep, but open some doors for you to look around on. The first thing that I want to say is that let's look at this from a very basic perspective that you're playing this out of two speakers more than likely. You might be doing some surround sound mixing, and that's going to be different. But let's just look at this. You're coming out of two speakers or two headphones. Now, the basic reality of that is, what can you do with spatialization in that area? Now, that's your environment. That is the inductor that's going to be, the sound's going to be coming out of. So what can you do for spatialization there? So the reality of it is, let's talk about a huge impulse response that somebody spent a whole lot of time making that's very, that's took a lot of work and there was a lot of thought put into it. Now, how much of that is going to actually get represented in your sound? First of all, when you're doing your mixing and you're doing your body building with reverbs and delays on your tracks to try to build body of that sound, and you do spatialization on that as far as doubling the track to do some stereo widening on your sound as you're working with it, that by the time you get to the point of reverberations and impulse responses and things like that, that how much of that is actually going to get really represented through two speakers. Through two headphones, you can actually start to get some binaural effects, which is another cool thing that is very limited with its abilities and what it can do in the environment you're working in. And so a lot of times is that you really want to look at it as that point from that perspective, because you've got this impulse response is set up for, you're in the middle of this room in this binaural effective that, the impulse response is all around you in this binaural cool thing, and it's this cathedral effect. Well, when you put it on your audio, that in a full mix, what's it going to do to it? Well, basically that your audio and your formatting and then the inductor that it's coming out of, after you've got done with your production, is going to look at it like a whole bunch of delay. A whole bunch of delays at different timings bouncing back at you, from two speakers. So really, that whole effect is going to get lost. It will do some, to some extent it can help, but a lot of times you can just get lost in that and it be a waste of time. That in the end, it's, it's like putting on way too many delays that is basically muddying your mix and not doing what you want it to do. Where if you scaled way down to where you're dealing with delays and some reverberations really lightly on individual tracks and then lightly on a whole mix to try to just kind of give it a little bit of space or a specific type of reverb to try to tint the sound a little bit, to color it a little bit, that you're much better probably working at it from that perspective, because otherwise you're really going to be dealing with a lot of mud. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there, because that whole study is really cool if you're dealing with headphones and binaural pan and things that can deal with surround sound. I mean, those concepts can be mind-boggling and do such cool things with stereo and your acoustical treatment and how you're dealing with impulse responses and how you can actually use them in that environment. But let's come back to where we're working from, probably. If you're not, I'm sorry. You definitely got some work to do, and I know so. And it's a lot of fun trying to spatialize that kind of stuff, surround sound, and anything like that that's binaural, because it can get very complex. And the more instruments you got, the more complex it can get. And you got to be real careful, because you can have a real muddy mess in no time. But if you do it correctly, it can be a beautiful thing. But let's look at it from what we're looking at. Okay, so from our perspective, when we're looking at our monitors or in our headphones, headphones are great for hearing what's going on. But most of the time, people will hear out of their earbuds. What are the chances are their earbuds or their cheap headphones going to be like the headphones you bought for, unless they're, audiophiles, going to really reproduce that? And let's say that you made it for the audio file, but it's going to be played on their stuff. What is that kind of stuff going to do to their equipment? And how is it going to, that inductors that they're listening to it from, going to interpolate that, and interpret that and reproduce that? Well, a lot of times it can make a mess of it. So sometimes that's a whole nother aspect to look at your spatialization for who you're putting it out there for, and for what formatting and who you're targeting, to scale back those things sometimes because of the effect it's going to have on the end product for who you're targeting and who's probably going to be listening to it in their cheap headphones or their computer monitors while they're messing around at work. Is it going to do it justice and help it, or is it better to scale way back and try to get clarity? And, a big, huge thing is that, if you've got using reverbs and delays sometimes for bodybuilding and really building some effect, is if you know it's reverb, back off, it's too much. If you can tell something's happening, but you aren't really sure, you're good to go. You're really on to something there. You might want to push it just a little bit, but not too much. And you'll find that a lot of times you listen to a lot of stuff that sounds really good that you're not paying attention to any type of reverb. Every now and then for some section or a drum section or some kind of part, you'll hear reverb, and there are some spatialization, wow, yeah, do that word, because they planned it that way. So let's look at it from the real basic perspective in acoustics, and you're in the studio. The first tool you have is stereo. So when you're dealing with stereo stuff, what happens? If you take two mono tracks and you put them on either side of each other, you come out with a mono thing in your phase, right? So, some delay and some detuning on one of them, panned one way or the other, starts to build stereo for whatever instrument you're working on. And if you watch the video series I have on spatialization, that's the stereo field, that'll give you a lot better in-depth understanding of some of the things I'm talking about here. But basically, you're talking about trying to go lightly. One huge thing is doubling tracks and panning them off one side or the other, getting space in the panning area that you're working in, and putting delays on one side or the other of those doubled tracks and detuning them one side or the other a little bit, or tuning them up a little bit, and doing that differently with different instruments to try to build space. And it's a symphonic technique that if you do it very lightly in the studio and don't do it overboard because it'll make a muddy mess, that, like you've got 6 violins. Well, ain't none of them tuned exactly the same. One will be tuned down 3 cents, one will be tuned up 3 cents. I mean, things like that. The detunings and uptunings, that kind of stuff is building spatialization, acoustic spatialization. It really is. And that none of them, they're not exactly in time. Some of them will be out of time from the other ones, not enough to really notice. It'll be below the Haas effect of, whatever the Haas effect it is, where it sounds like it's doubling, but anywhere underneath that, it's building space. It's building acoustical spatialization, and it's a huge tool to do that. So you really want to take that into consideration, because that's one of the key things that's on here. It's always can be a lot different for every mix that I do or every production I do, but it's always in my mind to use those pannings and those delays and those detunings, and that spatialization and that stereo field is a huge aspect. Because one of the things that I'll do in that spatialization is I learned a really cool technique that is a really good symphonic technique, where they'll put like 9 microphones around the symphony and then record that. Well, the problem is you try to reproduce that in 2 speakers, you end up with a muddy mix. But what you can do is, if you watch some of the videos I made here on mixing, is that you've got reverberations. And the problem is with them is that you'll have like one reverb, like you're trying to build body, and you put one at like 12.2 milliseconds delay, one at, a 24.4 milliseconds delay, and one at 36.3 milliseconds delay, and the first one has no delay on it. And that, it basically works out as delay coming at you, because it can't build that spatialization that it was built to do because of what you're playing out of. So if you really scale it back, it can really help a lot. And you'll find out that the more you scale it back, and as you look at it that way, because you can understand that you're trying to stuff a room You're trying to hear a room out of 2 speakers. Well, you're going to get stereo effect, but you're not going to get that binaural effect. So all those delays, which basically what is reverberation and delays, you can start muddying things really fast. So, those kind of things you have to really take into consideration when you're using the spatialization, and really look at doubling your tracks, and look at the video that I put on, the video series I put on here about stereo field. That can really help you a lot. That you will really start to steer clear of a lot of those acoustical issues, and realize that a lot of them are overkill and are really going to start causing mud in your mix. I've got a room reverb in my studio that shows you where the guy is and where the microphone is, and and it basically, understand his height and all that, and it's cool, but you got to be real careful. That stuff just starts causing a mud, and then you're wasting your time with it. Some really cool things are like, you can go check out this impulse response modeler from Voxengo and build some impulse responses. But just remember that a lot of times you're dealing with a 2-dimensional plane. It's not a 3-dimensional area. So you spend all this time worried about this impulse. So if you scale down to something way more basic and tastefully added it to there, and, did your spatialization with your panning and your delays and your detunings and stuff like that, that those kind of delays and falling off, that kind of stuff can be really cool, because some of those impulse responses can really be based around some of the things we talked about the acoustical treatment of wherever that impulse response was taken. But use it lightly, because it really probably isn't going to have that much effect. Sometimes for amp modeling and stuff like that, it does a lot, but it can get lost in the mix if it's not out there in the front. And sometimes it can do a lot. So you really have to analyze that and make a decision of how that's affecting your mix. And that other program we talked about with the REW, taking your impulse response and throwing it in there, take a look at it. This is a medium hall, and what exactly is the impulse response in there? What is the impulse looking like? And there's full scale or DBFS and what it looks like in there. And analyze it. Take a look at what's going on. You get a waterfall view of it and a spectrogram of what it is, and it's to really understand what's going on. And when you start to get some understandings of that, trying to remember you have to relate this to 2 speakers that are coming out. That along a lot of the concepts that you're dealing with all this spatialization and your acoustics in that context aren't going to get re-representative in the arena that they're being played through. So you really have to keep that in mind. Here's another part of that program, frequency responses and modal distribution, where you can move the guy around in the room and see what the different frequency responses are going to be. Remove the speakers around to see how that's going to do it. His height, how's his height going to do? Move the height of the speaker around all over the place. I mean, all these tools can be really cool to help you understand, to simulate rooms and understand that. But the biggest thing is some of this stuff is really out of context for what you're doing, because this guy's working on all this stuff for acoustical treatments, and he's going to build himself an opera house. Well, you're not. You got 2 earbuds, 2 cheap earbuds, or somebody's 2 cheap, computer speakers, or you might get lucky. An audiophile, has got $3,000 speakers, that blow your crap out of the water, and he's like, oh, dude, yeah, and you spent some time on it, and so you really have to come to the understanding of what you're setting yourself up for and where that stuff's going to be listened from. And all that stuff is, when you look at this stuff here and you're looking at this layout, like here, this spatialization of this symphony, well, it's a real, it's 2-dimensional, it's a plane. That's how it's coming out there. It's not 3-dimensional. You can work on some 3-dimensional aspects, but it's going to be very limited. It's not 3-dimensional. So, trying to deal with it in a 3-dimensional aspect can cause you more harm than good by mudding things up. So be real careful of that, especially with impulse responses, convolution reverb, room reverbs, and all that kind of stuff. Go light and try to approach it the way I was saying. You'll have much better luck dealing with those delays and light reverbs to build spatialization and acoustic balance. I hope that helped a lot and gave you some direction that helps you a lot and helps you to understand. Peace, hope, love.